The moment Daniel Bancroft heard a woman's voice ask if anyone in Caldwell, Kansas could tell her where to find a room for the night, he dropped the horseshoe he had been hammering and stood completely still for the first time in 8 years. It was the summer of 1882, and Caldwell sat perched right on the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a man leaning too far over a cliff, half civilized and half wild, smelling of cattle and dust, and the particular desperation of people who had traveled too far to turn back. The town had grown fast in the years since the cattle drives pushed north, and with growth had come saloons and gamblers and men who spent their wages in a single night. But it had also brought a hardware store, a newspaper, 2 churches, and a school that sat half-finished at the edge of the main road, waiting for someone with enough civic enthusiasm to collect the remaining funds. Daniel had been the town's blacksmith for 6 of those 8 years. Before Caldwell, he had been other things in other places, but he did not think about those other places if he could help it. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of hammer work, with hands that were calloused and scarred and useful, and a face that the sun had tanned to the color of old leather. He was not an ugly man, though he seemed determined to be an invisible one. He did his work, he collected his pay, he ate at the boarding house where he rented a room, and he went to bed. He spoke to men when business required it. He had not spoken to a woman in so long that it had stopped feeling like a loss and had simply become the shape of his life, the way a river carves a channel and then forgets it ever flowed anywhere else. He had not said a woman's name out loud in 8 years. That was not an accident. That was a fortress built one silent day at a time. The woman standing in the middle of the main street of Caldwell looked like she had been traveling for several days and had not particularly enjoyed any of them. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with dark hair pinned up under a bonnet that had seen better decades, and a traveling dress of practical gray wool that was dusty at the hem and missing one small button near the collar. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a carpet bag that appeared to weigh approximately as much as a small mule in the other, and she was looking around the street with the expression of someone who had expected less and found exactly that. She had asked her question clearly, without embarrassment, without the particular shrinking quality that some women adopted when they found themselves alone in rough company. She simply stood there and waited for an answer. Most of the men on the street looked away. That was the way of things in Caldwell. A woman traveling alone meant complications, and complications were something most men in cattle country preferred to avoid. Daniel did not look away. He did not know why he did not look away. He had been looking away from women for 8 years with the practiced ease of a man who has made peace with a necessary sacrifice. But something about the way she stood there, practical and unflinching, with the dust settling around her boots like the town itself was sizing her up, made him walk forward before he had decided to do it. He stopped a respectful distance away, because he was a man who understood the significance of space, and he took off his hat, because his mother had raised him before the world had unmade most of what she had built. "Mrs. Hennessy runs a boarding house on Cedar Street," he said. "Second house past the milliner's. She keeps a clean place." The woman looked at him with eyes that were a particular shade of amber, like creek water over copper-colored stones, and she said, "Thank you kindly. I appreciate that." Then she tilted her head slightly and said, "I am Eudora Mercer. I have just arrived from St. Louis." And he opened his mouth to say something perfectly ordinary, to say "you're welcome" or "safe travels" or any of the dozen unremarkable things a person says when a conversation is ending, and instead what came out of him was her name. "Eudora," he said, just that, just the single word. It came out of him, the way a man says a word in a foreign language for the first time, carefully, with a kind of reverence that surprises him, tasting the syllables as though he is not entirely sure they are real. It sat in the air between them for a moment, 3 syllables of a woman's name spoken by a man who had forbidden himself that particular sound for 8 years, and the surprise of it hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a physical thing. She looked at him with a small, curious expression, not offended, not frightened, simply observant. "That's right," she said. "And you are." He had to think about it. Not because he had forgotten his name, but because the act of speaking her name had shaken something loose inside him that he was not prepared to examine in the middle of a dusty street with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Bancroft. I run the blacksmith shop on the north end." "Well, Daniel Bancroft," she said, "I thank you for the direction." She shifted the carpet bag from one hand to the other with a small grunt of effort that she made no attempt to conceal, which he found he liked immediately, and she started walking in the direction he had indicated. He watched her go. He stood in the middle of the street with his hat in his hand and watched her walk towards Cedar Street, and he thought about the way her name had come out of him unbidden, like water finding a crack in stone. He went back to the horseshoe. He picked it up with the tongs and held it over the coals and watched it glow red, and he told himself that the encounter was finished, and that was fine, and that was right, and that was the way things should be. He told himself that several more times before he went to bed that night. Eudora Mercer had come to Caldwell for a reason, which was that she was not the sort of woman who went anywhere without one. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who had run a millinery shop until her health declined, and she had been educated in the particular way that intelligent women of modest means are educated, which is to say thoroughly in the things that cost nothing and practically wherever she could manage it. She could read Latin and cipher accounts, and set a broken bone if necessary. And she had spent the last 3 years working as a teacher's assistant in a school on the east side of St. Louis that served the children of factory workers. She had come to Caldwell because she had heard about the half-finished schoolhouse and the town's desperate need for a teacher, and she had written a letter to the town council 3 months prior offering her services. The town council, consisting primarily of men who were tired of their children running wild during the day, had written back with a speed that suggested considerable relief, and here she was. She was not running from anything. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had made a deliberate choice to come here, to this raw and sunburned edge of Kansas, because she believed that teaching was important work, and because she was 27 years old and she had spent enough of her life being sensible in familiar places, and she wanted just once to do something that felt like leaning into the wind. She did not think about the fact that she was alone in the world since her mother had died the previous winter, and that her father had been gone since she was 16. She did not think about how the particular loneliness of being entirely without family had begun to settle over her like weather. She was here to teach school. That was enough. Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house was indeed clean, and Mrs. Hennessy herself was a compact Irish woman of about 50 who had come to Caldwell with her late husband and stayed, because leaving seemed like too much effort. She had a sharp tongue and a generous table, and she ran her house with the kind of absolute authority that suggested she had once been a general in another life. She looked Eudora over when she arrived, asked a series of rapid questions about her origins and her purpose, and then decided she approved. "The new schoolteacher," she said, with something that might have been satisfaction. "Good. Those children are completely beyond redemption, and it will be someone else's problem. You'll take the room at the top of the stairs." The room at the top of the stairs was small and had a window that looked out over the back of the livery stable, which was not exactly scenic, but it was clean and it was hers, and Eudora stood in the center of it after Mrs. Hennessy had gone and felt something in her chest that was close to determination. This was going to work. She was going to make it work. She had not thought about the blacksmith with the careful eyes and the way he had said her name. She thought about it now. It had been a strange thing, the way he had said it. Most men, when they learned a woman's name, either repeated it with the mechanical courtesy of someone filing information away, or they used it immediately and too often as a form of false familiarity. He had said it the way someone might say the name of a country they had always wanted to visit, with a kind of wondering weight, and then he had looked briefly surprised at himself, as though he had not meant to say it at all. She put it out of her mind. She had a school to prepare for. The schoolhouse was, as advertised, half finished. The walls were standing and the roof was solid, but the interior had no desks, no blackboard. Only 2 of the 4 planned windows were installed, and the front door hung at a slight angle that made it scrape against the frame every time it opened or closed. The town council had gathered 3 members of itself in Eudora's presence the morning after her arrival to explain that they were, as they put it, working on it, and that they expected to have the school mostly ready by the time she needed to begin classes in September, which was 6 weeks away. She had looked at the building and then at the 3 men and said, very pleasantly, "Gentlemen, I can see that the work remaining is significant. I would like to understand what specific help I can request from the community to have this completed in time." The 3 men looked at each other. It was clear that they had expected a more passive response. "Well," said the eldest of them, a Mr. Aldous Pratt who owned the general store and had the confident manner of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, "we'll put out word that volunteers are needed." "That would be wonderful," Eudora said. "I will also be speaking to anyone in town who has skills that might be useful. I hope you'll lend your support." She went looking for help the next morning with her notebook and her practical boots, and the second person she approached, after a carpenter named Fowler who said he might have 2 free days in the coming week, was Daniel Bancroft. She found him at the forge, which was a large open-fronted structure with a roof of corrugated iron that caught the morning heat and held it like a furnace. He was working on what appeared to be a wagon wheel rim, and he did not notice her approaching until she spoke, at which point he startled slightly and then went very still in the particular way of a person trying to appear as though they had not startled. "Mr. Bancroft," she said, "good morning. I apologize for interrupting your work." "Miss Mercer," he said, and she noticed that her name came out of him with that same careful quality as before, as though each letter required individual consideration. "No interruption. I wonder if I might ask your advice," she said. "The schoolhouse needs metal fittings for the window frames on the south side, and the door hinges are badly fitted and causing the door to drag. I have been told you are the person to speak to about such things." He set down his hammer and turned to face her properly. In the morning light he looked different from how she had registered him in the street. He was taller than she had remembered, and there was a quality of careful attention in his face that she had seen before in a few particular people, the kind of attention that suggested someone who watched and thought more than they spoke. "Window fittings I can do," he said. "What size are the frames?" She described them as precisely as she could, and he listened with his full attention, and then he asked 3 specific questions about the wood thickness and the style of latch that had been attempted before, and she was able to answer 2 of them and told him honestly she did not know the answer to the 3rd. "I'll come and have a look," he said. He said it as though the offer had surprised him slightly. He seemed to be a man who occasionally surprised himself. "I would appreciate that very much," she said. He came that afternoon. He walked around the schoolhouse in silence for a long time, looking at the walls and the windows and the badly hung door, and Eudora followed at a respectful distance and made notes in her book. She noticed that he touched things as he examined them, running his hand along the wood of the window frame to feel the grain and the fit, pressing the door gently in its frame to feel where the resistance was, the way a person reads something written in a language they know well. "The hinges are the wrong size for the door's weight," he said finally. "Whoever fitted them used barn hinges. You need something heavier." He looked at the south windows. "The frame dimensions are standard. I can have fittings ready in 3 days." "What would you charge?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "The school needs it." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Bancroft, I intend to pay for the materials at least. The materials are minimal." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite uncomfortable but was in the neighborhood. Consider it a civic contribution. She could see that arguing further would embarrass him, so she said only, "Thank you. I will remember it." She came back 3 days later to find him already there, fitting the window hardware with the focused ease of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. Carpenter Fowler was also there, building the frame for the blackboard on the front wall, and 2 other men from town had shown up in response to the general notice, and were wrestling a set of newly arrived school desks into the building from a wagon outside. Eudora organized the chaos with cheerful efficiency. She directed the desks into rows, conferred with Fowler about the blackboard height, and at one point climbed partway up a ladder to take measurements near the ceiling because she needed to know how much blackboard paint she would require. And when she came back down, she found Daniel standing at the base of the ladder watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. "I could have done that," he said. "I managed fine," she said pleasantly, handing him the end of the measuring tape. "Will you hold this while I take the width?" He held the tape. They were close together in the measuring, closer than they had been before, and she was aware of the particular quality of his silence, which was not empty the way some people's silence was empty, but full, the way a room is full of something you cannot see but can feel. "Have you always been in Caldwell?" she asked, because she was a naturally curious person and could not help it. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. 6 years, he said finally. "Before that, other places." She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. "I am from St. Louis," she offered, partly because she thought the giving of information might encourage the receiving of it, and partly because she simply thought he might be interested. "Though my family was originally from Virginia, my grandfather came west after the war." Something shifted in his face at the mention of the war, a small tightening around the eyes that he controlled quickly. She filed that away without pressing it. "There," she said when she had the measurement she needed. "Thank you." She stepped back and made a note in her book. "Are you from this region originally, Mr. Bancroft?" "No," he said. She looked up from her notes and smiled at him, not broadly, not in the pressing way, but with a genuine warmth that she hoped communicated that she was not interrogating him, only talking, the way people talk when they are standing next to each other and working. "You do not have to tell me your history," she said. "I was only making conversation." He looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. "Missouri," he said. "Originally." "We're practically neighbors then," she said. Something in his expression shifted again, towards something that was not quite a smile but might have been its shadow. "I suppose we are," he said. The school opened in September with 17 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, 3 oil lamps, a proper blackboard, 2 south-facing windows with correctly fitted hardware, and a door that opened and closed without difficulty. Eudora stood at the front of the room on the first morning with chalk in her hand, and felt something she recognized as rightness, the particular alignment that comes when a person is doing the thing they are suited for. She was a good teacher. She had always known she was a good teacher in the way that a person knows a fact about themselves that they have not quite decided what to do with. She was patient with the slow learners and genuinely challenged by the quick ones, and she had the ability, which she had come to understand was rare, to make a child feel that their question was the most interesting question that had ever been asked. Within 2 weeks, parents were speaking her name with the tone of approval that teachers in small towns either earn quickly or never earn at all. Mrs. Hennessy told her over dinner one evening that she was the talk of Cedar Street, and said it as the highest of compliments. Daniel heard about the school through the ordinary channels of small-town life, which meant that he heard about it from 3 different men in the course of a single morning at the forge, all of whom wanted to express their opinion about the new schoolteacher's various virtues. He listened without comment and went back to his work and found, to his annoyance, that he was thinking about amber-colored eyes and the way she had climbed that ladder without hesitation. He had no business thinking about any of that. But he noticed, over the weeks that followed, that Caldwell was not large enough to avoid someone entirely, especially someone who had become as present in the life of the town as Eudora Mercer seemed to become almost immediately. He saw her at the general store. He saw her at the post office, which she visited with the frequency of someone waiting for something important. He saw her once at the edge of town at dusk, standing very still and watching the sunset over the plains with the look of a person who has just discovered a view they had not expected to move them. And that particular image stayed with him longer than he liked. He had been 8 years without saying a woman's name out loud. He had been 8 years without allowing himself to care about a woman's coming or going. He had made that choice in a particular place, on a particular night, and he had held to it with the stubbornness of a man who believes that his stubbornness is the only thing keeping him upright. Her name had a way of appearing at the back of his mind uninvited. Eudora. 3 syllables, warm and a little old-fashioned and entirely specific to her. He did not say it out loud again. He had said it once and that had been enough, more than enough, far too much if he was being honest with himself, which he generally tried to be. He told himself this was nothing. Proximity and curiosity. The natural interest a man feels when someone new arrives in a small town. Nothing more. He believed this less convincingly each time he had to say it. In October, one of Eudora's students, a boy of 9 named Tommy Pratt, who was the son of Aldous Pratt and had inherited his father's confidence without yet earning it, came to school with a cut on his hand that had gone 3 days without proper cleaning and was showing signs of infection. Eudora cleaned and dressed the wound with the supplies she had begun keeping in the schoolroom after learning that the nearest doctor was in Wellington, a day's ride away, and she sent a note home to his mother about watching the hand carefully. That evening, she learned from Mrs. Hennessy that the town had been without a doctor for the past 8 months, since the previous one had departed for more promising opportunities in Dodge City, and that the town council had been attempting without success to attract a replacement. She mentioned this the next Sunday after church, in the gathering that happened naturally on the church steps as the congregation dispersed into the October morning, and the subject attracted the usual combination of concern and resigned helplessness that seems to settle over small communities when confronted with problems that feel too large for local solutions. Daniel was not standing on the church steps. He attended the early service when the church was less crowded, and he stood at the back and left before the gathering started. He was a man who had learned to occupy the margins of community, present enough to function, far enough back to remain untouched. He heard about the doctor problem from the same chain of informants who kept him current on town business, and he thought briefly about the way a town like Caldwell was always one bad winter away from the kind of trouble that a single capable person could have prevented. He thought about Eudora dressing a boy's infected hand with whatever she had on hand in a schoolroom. He did something he had not done in 6 years. He went to a town council meeting. He stood at the back of the meeting room, which was the rear section of Aldous Pratt's general store with the barrels pushed to one side, and he listened to the council discuss the doctor problem with the circular lack of progress that seemed to characterize their discussions of most things. And when there was a pause, he said, from the back of the room, "I know a man, trained in Cincinnati. He's been working for the railroad in Wichita, but the last I heard he was considering a change." Everyone turned to look at him. He was not a man who spoke at meetings. "His name is Henry Graves," he said. "He's a good doctor. He's done field surgery and general medicine, and he's not particular about where he works as long as the work is honest." He stopped. He had said enough. "I can write to him if the council wants to pursue it." There was a brief silence and then a flurry of enthusiastic agreement from the council, and he wrote the letter that evening at the small desk in his boarding house room, aware that he was doing something he could not fully explain, and that explaining it to himself as civic duty was technically accurate and not the whole truth. The letter went out in the October Post. He went back to his work. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, Eudora was walking from the school back toward Cedar Street when she came across a situation on the main road that required her immediate attention. A cattle drover's wagon had come through town too fast, which was not unusual, and had clipped the corner of Mr. and Mrs. Luca Diaz's fence, which was also not entirely unusual. But the impact had sent the wagon sideways into the street, and the horses had tangled in their traces and were now pulling against each other in a panicked way that was escalating rapidly. The drover was shouting, which was not helping the horses. Several men were watching from the boardwalk with the helpful inactivity that tends to prevail in moments of animal emergency. Eudora set down her satchel on the boardwalk and walked into the street with no visible hesitation. She knew horses. Her grandfather had kept horses in Virginia and then in Missouri, and she had grown up with them in the way that children who grow up around animals do, with a fundamental familiarity that does not leave you even when years have passed. She went to the nearer of the two panicked horses and put her hand on its nose and spoke to it in a low, steady voice. Not any particular words, just sound, steady and warm, and the horse shuddered and then stilled a little, and she worked her way along its neck to where the harness had twisted and began untangling it with careful hands. The second horse was still moving. The traces were still crossed. She needed someone to hold the second horse. She looked up and Daniel was there. She did not know where he had come from, whether he had seen from the forge or had been passing, or whether some instinct had brought him to the same problem from a different direction. But he was there, and he went to the second horse the way she had gone to the first, with the same low voice and unhurried hands, and between the two of them they had both horses steady and the traces untangled inside of 4 minutes. The drover climbed down from the wagon seat and was effusive in his gratitude in a way that suggested he knew he had been at fault and was hoping that gratitude would serve where apology would not. Eudora received his thanks pleasantly and went to retrieve her satchel from the boardwalk. Daniel fell into step beside her, which surprised her. He had not, in the weeks since the schoolhouse work, done anything that could be interpreted as seeking her company. "You know horses," he said. "My grandfather raised them," she said. "I always felt at home with them." They walked a few steps in the silence that seemed to be his natural medium. She had come to understand that his silences were not unfriendly, they were simply honest. He spoke when he had something to say and not otherwise, and she found she respected that enormously. "That was good work," he said. "Most people would have waited for someone else to handle it. Most people are waiting for most things," she said. "In my experience." He looked at her sideways with that near smile. "That's a bleak observation." "I prefer to think of it as a fact with a silver lining," she said. "If most people are waiting, there's always room for someone who is not." They walked as far as the fork where their paths diverged, and he stopped and she stopped, and there was a moment in which Caldwell went about its business around them, and the October air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke and approaching winter, and she thought he was going to say something more. He looked like he was about to. But instead he touched the brim of his hat and said good evening and went the other direction. She stood for a moment watching him go and felt something she chose not to name quite yet, because naming things too early was a habit she had worked to break. She did write a letter that evening, not a personal one, but a letter to the Kansas State Board of Education requesting additional primers and a set of arithmetic texts, because she was the sort of person who used her evenings productively. She put it in the post the next morning. At the post office she encountered Daniel, who was apparently collecting something, and who looked slightly startled to see her there before composing himself. The postmistress, a woman named Clara Webb who had lived in Caldwell long enough to know most of its business, looked between them with an expression of entirely undisguised curiosity. "Good morning," Eudora said. "Good morning," he said. "Cold today," she offered. "It'll be colder by December," he said. He seemed to be making an effort. "The winters here are not mild." "I gathered as much," she said. "Mrs. Hennessy has already begun telling me about the winter of 1879 in a tone that suggests I should be preparing for siege warfare." The near smile appeared again, stronger this time. "She told me the same story when I arrived," he said. "She tells it every October. She has added details over the years." She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not performed, not managed, just the natural response to something actually amusing, and she saw him look at her when she laughed with an expression that he did not manage quickly enough. Something open and unguarded that he closed before it could fully form, but she had seen it. She thought about that expression for the rest of the morning while she taught fractions to a group of 10-year-olds. November came in cold and gray and businesslike, the way November comes to the southern Kansas plains, with the serious intent of a season that knows it has work to do. The cattle drives had ended for the year, and Caldwell had settled into its winter self, quieter and less rough around the edges. The seasonal population of drovers and gamblers replaced by the permanent population of farmers and tradespeople and families who had decided, for better or worse, that this was their place. Eudora had become fully part of that permanent population in the way that good teachers always do, which is to say that she had become indispensable. She knew the names of every child in her school and most of their parents. She had organized with Mrs. Hennessy's assistants, a lending library of sorts using donated books and her own collection, which had become the occasion for a regular Friday evening gathering in the school room, where people came to return books and drink coffee and argue pleasantly about what they had read. It was the sort of thing Caldwell had not known it needed and could not now imagine doing without. Daniel came to the second Friday gathering. He stood in the back of the room with a cup of coffee and listened to a debate about whether Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe was a plausible account of survival or a fantasy dressed up as one. And when the question reached him, he said, without being asked, plausible in the fundamentals, implausible in the details of supply. And then he said nothing more, but the group looked at him with the surprised attention of people who have discovered an unexpected opinion, and Eudora, across the room, looked at him too. She deliberately did not cross the room to speak to him. She was not going to be obvious about this. She had a room full of people to attend to, and she attended to them. But when the gathering ended and people were putting on their coats, she found herself near him at the door and said, because it was natural and true, "I am glad you came." "It's a good thing you've started," he said. He was looking at his hat brim rather than at her, which she had noticed he did sometimes when he was saying something that cost him something. "The town needs more of this kind of thing." "I think so too," she said. "I hope you'll come again." He looked up then directly with those careful eyes. "I expect I will," he said. He left. She stood at the door for a moment in the cold air and felt the warmth of those 4 words settle somewhere in her chest like an ember. Mrs. Hennessy, appearing at her elbow with the quiet arrival of a woman who has made it her business to notice things, said, "That man has not come to a social gathering in the 6 years I have known him." "He came to a civic meeting last month," Eudora said carefully. "He also did that for the first time in 6 years," Mrs. Hennessy said, without any particular emphasis, and went back inside to collect the coffee cups. Eudora did not sleep particularly well that night, which she attributed to the 3 cups of coffee she had drunk at her own event. Henry Graves arrived in Caldwell in the second week of November on the morning stage from Wichita, carrying a large medical bag and a small trunk, and an expression of cheerful resignation that suggested he had arrived in difficult places before and had made his peace with them. He was 43 years old, compact and quick-eyed and businesslike, and he set up his practice in the 2-room building that the council had prepared for him with a speed that impressed even Aldous Pratt. He came to the school on his second day in town, not because he had been asked to, but because he had seen the building and concluded that a school and a doctor's office should have an understanding, and Eudora received him with immediate warmth and showed him the supply cabinet she had assembled and gave him her honest assessment of which children she was concerned about and why. He looked at her over the cabinet with an evaluating expression. "Bancroft said you were competent," he said. He understated it. "You know Mr. Bancroft," she said, keeping her voice even. "We were acquainted in Missouri years ago," Graves said. "He wrote to me about this position. I would not have known to come here otherwise." He tilted his head. "I don't think he does things like that for anyone, generally speaking." She had no response to that which she was willing to say out loud, so she simply returned to the subject of the medicine cabinet and the children's health, and Dr. Graves, who was clearly not unintelligent, changed the subject with polite precision. She brought up the letter that evening, not in the school room, not in any planned way, but because she happened to be at the general store at the same time as Daniel, and they were walking out together in the natural way that people walk out of a store together when they have finished their business at the same time, and the words came out of her before she had quite decided on them. "Dr. Graves mentioned you wrote to him about the position," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone needed to," he said. "He seems very capable," she said. "The town is lucky to have him." "Yes." She looked at the cold sky over the buildings and then back at him. "It was a kind thing to do." He had that look again, the one he got when a thing cost him something, glancing away and then back. "The town needed a doctor," he said. "It wasn't sentiment." "It was good judgment then," she said pleasantly, refusing to let him retreat entirely into practicality. Either way, it was good for Caldwell. They were at the fork in the road again, the same place where they had stopped in October, and she was struck by the thought that they kept arriving at this point and stopping and parting, and that this was some kind of evidence of something, though she was not sure what kind. "Eudora," he said. She waited. He had said her name 3 or 4 times now, and it was still strange to hear it from him, still that quality of careful weight, as though the name itself required handling with particular attention. "There is a dinner at the church on the 20th, he said. "The harvest supper. Mrs. Hennessy mentioned it." He paused. "I was wondering if you had a companion for the evening." The question came out of him with the effortful quality of a person who has translated something from one language to another and is not entirely certain they have the right words. She felt a tenderness for that effort that she had not expected. "I do not," she said. "Would you be willing to go with me?" he said. She looked at him in the gray November light and thought about the horseshoe he had dropped when she first spoke in the street, about the way he had said her name like he was learning a new language, about the care with which he had fitted the school windows, about the fact that he had written a letter to bring a doctor to a town he seemed determined to inhabit only from the margins of. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Something in his face did something complicated, as though it could not quite organize itself around the answer, but what she could see in it was relief and a kind of careful gladness that he was not performing for her benefit, that was simply there. "Good," he said. "I'll call for you at 6. He touched his hat and walked away, and she stood at the fork in the road in the November cold and thought that something had shifted, quietly and definitely, like a door opening somewhere in a house you thought was all locked rooms. The harvest supper was held on a Friday evening, and Caldwell dressed itself up for the occasion in the modest but genuine way of a community that does not have many occasions for formality, and intends to honor the ones it does. The church was hung with dried corn and late autumn wildflowers, and the tables along the walls were covered with white cloth and loaded with food, because whatever else the women of Caldwell might lack, they had never been short on cooking. Daniel arrived at the boarding-house door at 6 o'clock exactly, which did not surprise Eudora, who had him figured for a punctual man. He had made evident effort with his appearance, a dark coat she had not seen before, his hair combed back, his boots clean. He looked like a man who has done his best with the materials available and is quietly hoping it is enough. She had worn her best dress, which was deep blue wool with ivory buttons down the front, and she had pinned her hair up carefully, and she had taken longer at the mirror than she usually did, which she acknowledged to herself without apology. When she came down the stairs and he saw her, that unguarded expression appeared again and stayed longer this time before he composed it, and she thought, "There it is. Whatever this is, there it is." "You look well," he said, with a precision that suggested he had considered and rejected several other versions of the same statement. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They walked to the church in the cold, clear air, and she put her hand through his arm because the path was uneven and the wind was sharp, and she felt him go slightly still at the contact, and then, gradually, settle, the way a startled horse settles when it decides the source of alarm is not dangerous. At the church, they were immediately absorbed into the social structure of the event, which involved a great deal of introduction and food, and the kind of cheerful noise that comes when a community is feeling good about itself. Eudora was in her natural element in a gathering like this, moving easily from conversation to conversation, genuinely interested in people. She watched Daniel navigate it with somewhat less ease but more willingness than she would have expected, and she noticed that several people looked at him with a kind of hopeful surprise, the expression of people watching someone emerge from a long winter. They sat together at dinner, and Dr. Graves was at the same table, and he was good company, full of stories from his years with the railroad that were funny and slightly improbable, and he watched Daniel and Eudora with the good humor of a man who is pleased by what he sees and not inclined to press it. After dinner there was music, because there was always music in Caldwell when the occasion permitted, a fiddle and a guitar and a man with a harmonica who knew approximately 140 songs and was willing to play all of them. There was dancing in the space cleared in the center of the room. Eudora did not ask Daniel to dance. She thought he would find a way to suggest he did not dance. But after the second song he turned to her and said, "Do you dance?" And when she said yes, he stood up and offered his hand with the manner of a man who has decided something and intends to see it through. He danced the way he did most things, carefully and with full attention and better than she had expected. He held her properly, not too close, not stiffly, and he looked at her rather than at his feet, which she appreciated because men who look at their feet when dancing are no company at all. "You dance well," she said. "My mother insisted on it," he said. "She said it was necessary for civilized life." "She was right," Eudora said. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman." "She was," he said. The past tense sat between them gently, without sharpness. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago," he said, but the way he said it told her it was not as long as he made it sound, or perhaps that time does not always work the way we hope when loss is involved. They danced twice and then stood at the edge of the room watching others dance, and he brought her a cup of cider from the refreshment table, and they talked. They talked in a way they had not quite talked before, not with the practical structure of school matters or town business, but with the meandering ease of people who have decided they are interested in each other's minds. She told him about her teaching in St. Louis, about the factory children who had come to school half asleep from working dawn shifts and had still been eager to learn, and he listened with his full attention and asked questions that showed he had listened. He told her, carefully and in small pieces, about learning blacksmithing from an old man in Missouri who had talked constantly while he worked and had opinions about everything. And she laughed at the stories and watched his face as he talked and saw that the careful quality in him was not coldness, as she might have thought when she first saw him. It was protection, but not of the kind that keeps the world out. It was the protection of someone who has learned that caring costs something and who has not yet decided whether what she was offering was worth the price of another attempt. Walking her home after, he kept her hand on his arm and she did not remove it. The town was quiet around them, the cold deep and the stars extraordinary over the plains, and she thought about how far she was from St. Louis and how completely right it felt to be exactly here. At the boarding house door he stopped and turned to her. He was looking at her with that open expression, the one that cost him something, and she waited with the patience of a teacher who knows that some answers cannot be hurried. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been something of a solitary man," he said. For some years, by deliberate choice, he was looking at her steadily now, having apparently decided that the difficulty of looking was less than the dishonesty of looking away. "I want you to know that so that if I am awkward or cautious in my manner toward you, you understand it's not indifference. It is the opposite of indifference." She let that sit for a moment. "I understand that," she said. She thought about what to give in return, what was honest and proportionate. "I am not fragile," she said, "and I am not in a hurry. I am simply glad you are here." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Eudora," And this time her name in his mouth had a different quality than it had before, still careful, still weighted, but with something underneath it now that had not been there before, something that was trying to grow toward the light. "Good night, Daniel," she said, and went inside. December came in with a blizzard that announced itself on a Tuesday morning and did not conclude until Thursday afternoon, leaving Caldwell buried under 14 inches of snow and giving the entire population 2 days of enforced proximity with their own thoughts and their nearest neighbors. School was canceled. The stage stopped running. The streets were impassable for anything except a man on horseback with a serious reason to be there. Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house became an island of warmth and loud opinion, as there were 4 boarders besides Eudora, and they were all confined to the parlor by the weather, and had to find ways to occupy themselves that did not involve conflict. Mrs. Hennessy dealt with potential conflict by the simple method of keeping everyone fed at 2-hour intervals, which meant that energy that might otherwise have been directed at each other was directed instead at soup. On the second afternoon of the blizzard, Daniel appeared at the boarding house door with a load of firewood, because his forge was shut down, and he had thought that boarding houses might be running low on fuel. He brought enough wood to last 3 days, stacking it in the side alcove off the kitchen, and Mrs. Hennessy thanked him with the warmth of a woman who genuinely appreciates practical assistance, and he was invited to stay for dinner, which was a venison stew that smelled extraordinary. He sat across from Eudora at the long kitchen table, and they ate with the other boarders and Mrs. Hennessy, who presided at the head of the table with the satisfaction of a woman feeding people who are visibly grateful, and the conversation was easy and various and warm with the particular warmth of people sheltered against bad weather. After dinner, the other boarders drifted toward the parlor and the fire, and Mrs. Hennessy retired to her accounts, and Daniel and Eudora found themselves standing in the kitchen with the cleared table between them, the lamp making the room golden. "Will you sit a while?" she asked. He sat. She made tea because she had been doing so for people all her life, and it came naturally, and she brought the cups to the table and sat across from him, and the blizzard made its sound against the windows and the lamp burned steadily. "You have been well?" she asked, because it was the opening of the particular kind of conversation she wanted to have with him. "Yes," he said. He turned the teacup in his hands. "I have been thinking." She waited. "I owe you something more honest than what I said on the church steps," he said, "when I told you I had been deliberately solitary." "You owe me nothing," she said. "I want to tell you," he said, with the firmness of someone who has decided something. "I want to be honest with you, Eudora. I think you deserve that if we are to—" He paused. "If this is what I think it is." She looked at him across the table. "Tell me then," she said quietly. He looked at the teacup for a moment and then at her. "I was married," he said, "in Missouri before I came here. Her name was Sarah." He said the name with the steadiness of someone who has practiced this, who has made himself practice it in private so that the saying of it in front of another person does not break him. "She died in the winter of 1874, fever, and our child died with her, a son." He paused again. "He was 3 weeks old." The kitchen was very quiet except for the blizzard. Eudora looked at him and felt the weight of what he had carried for 8 years with a fullness that was not pity, because she understood pity was not what he needed and not what she felt. What she felt was something closer to witness, the recognition that this was what lay under the careful silence, under the 8 years of absence from women's company, under the way her name had come out of him that first day like something he had kept locked and had not known was still alive. He had not said a woman's name out loud in 8 years, she thought, and then she had introduced herself. "I am so sorry," she said. And then, because she believed in saying the names of people who had been lost, she said, "What was his name? Your son?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected that question. "William," he said. "We would have called him Will." "William is a good name," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "After I lost them, I did not want any of it," he said. "Any of the things that could be lost like that. I thought if I did not allow myself to want anything, I would not be able to lose it. He looked at her directly. I am telling you this because you should know what you are, what this situation is, not as a warning but as honesty. I understand, she said. She folded her hands on the table and considered what was true and what he needed to hear. Daniel, I am not asking you to replace anything or forget anything. I would never ask that. I am only myself. Eudora Mercer, schoolteacher, impractical sentimentalist, terrible chess player. She had learned this about herself at Mrs. Hennessy's table, who came to Caldwell in the summer and who found, somewhat to her surprise, that the company of a particular blacksmith is the best company she has found in a long time. He looked at her for a long moment. You are not what I expected, he said, with a wondering quality. I never am, she said, and the line landed with enough warmth that she saw the near smile again, fuller now, crossing more of his face. I do not know how to do this any more, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever I say or do that is wrong-footed or strange, it is not because, Daniel, she said gently. I am a schoolteacher. Teaching people to do things they do not know how to do yet is what I spend my days at. She paused. Just be honest with me. That's all. The near smile became a real smile, brief but complete, and she filed it away as something precious. The first real smile, the first one he had not controlled or hidden before it finished forming. I can do that, he said. They sat at the kitchen table talking until the fire in the range burned low and the lamp oil needed refilling. And they talked about nothing in particular, about books and the Kansas plains and what she intended to teach the children in the spring term and what it was like to run a forge in the winter. And under all of it there was the new and steady warmth of two people who have told each other the true things and found that the other person did not flinch. The blizzard ended on Thursday. Life resumed. January was cold and hard and full of work, but it had a quality that it had not had before. A quality that Eudora recognized as looking forward to things. She looked forward to Fridays when Daniel came to the reading gathering. She looked forward to the moments when she had business near the forge, or when he had business near the school, or when their paths crossed at the post office or the store, and they had learned the comfortable thing of walking together without needing a particular reason. He had started using her name more naturally. Not always, not without a certain care, but without the suspended quality that had marked it at first. Sometimes she heard him say it and thought she could trace the history of it, the 8 years of silence, and the moment at the beginning when it had come out of him unbidden, and the way he had said it since, each time reclaiming something, each time like relearning a language he had once spoken fluently. He brought her things without being asked. A piece of iron he had worked into a small decorative hook for the schoolroom wall, because the children's coats needed somewhere to go. A book from the general store that he had noticed and thought she would find interesting, a natural history of the Kansas prairie. A packet of the particular tea she preferred, which she had mentioned once in October and which he had apparently retained and acted on 3 months later. She taught him to play chess, because she had decided that her chess weakness was a correctable problem, and she needed a willing student. He turned out to be considerably better at chess than her after 4 lessons, which she pointed out was unfair, and which he received with visible pleasure. You think strategically, she said, examining the board after he had beaten her for the 3rd time. You consider several moves ahead. It's something I have had occasion to practice, he said. He was looking at the board with the comfortable focus of someone doing something they find natural, and she looked at the angle of his jaw and the steadiness of his hands, and felt something that she had been trying to name accurately for some weeks, and which she now recognized clearly as love. She did not say it yet. It was February and the ground was frozen and she was a practical woman. But she thought it, and knowing it gave her a particular quiet happiness. In late February, the schoolhouse stove developed a problem that threatened the south chimney flue with something Daniel diagnosed as a poorly fitted damper, and he came to the school on a Saturday to address it. He climbed onto the roof with a collection of tools and worked for 2 hours while Eudora stayed inside, and tested the draw of the fire at intervals, calling up to him through the flue that things were better or not yet better. When he came down, he was covered in soot from the chimney work, and she handed him a clean cloth and the water she had been heating on the stove, and there was a moment in which she was wiping a streak of soot from just beside his ear, because the cloth he was using was missing it, and she was close to him, and the empty school was full of late afternoon light, and he turned his face slightly toward her and said her name very quietly. "Eudora." She stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded expression, all of it open, nothing managed, the careful man entirely undefended. "Yes," she said, equally quiet. "I think I have been falling in love with you since you came down the main street of this town and asked where to find a room," he said. He said it with the directness of someone who has decided that if he is going to say something true, he will say it without ornament. "I wanted you to know. I am not practiced at this anymore, and I am likely to be imperfect at it, but I wanted to say it plainly so there is no question between us about where I stand." She set down the cloth. "Daniel Bancroft," she said, "I have been in love with you since you said my name for the first time in the middle of the road like it was a word you had just discovered and were not sure you deserved to say." She saw his eyes do something at that. "And for your information, I prefer honest and imperfect to polished and false." He kissed her. It was the first time, and it had the same quality as his speaking her name had always had, careful and wondering and exactly right, the action of a man who knows that some things are precious and treats them accordingly. She kissed him back with no reservation whatsoever, which she thought was probably the most honest thing about her. When they separated, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was uncomplicated happiness, simple and complete and entirely visible. "Good," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of her laughing in the empty school with the late winter light on the wooden floor and the repaired flue drawing clean and warm was, she would think later, one of the best sounds she had ever been part of. Spring came to the Kansas plains the way it always does, not gently but urgently, the way a long-imprisoned thing rushes out when the door opens. The prairie went from brown to green in what seemed like a week, and the Chisholm Trail woke back up with the cattle drives pushing north, and Caldwell filled back up with the seasonal population of drovers and traders, and the particular chaos of a trail town in its busy season. Eudora and Daniel were, by the standards of a small town, visibly keeping company, which meant everyone knew and most people approved, and a minority offered opinions that had not been requested. Mrs. Hennessy approved with the enthusiasm of a woman who believes she saw it coming from the beginning, which she possibly had. Dr. Graves offered Daniel a specific and sincere congratulation. Aldous Pratt expressed a vague concern about the schoolteacher's availability if she were to be married, which Eudora addressed by pointing out, with pleasant precision, that her marital status had no bearing on her professional capability, a response that ended the subject. She was aware that married female teachers in Kansas could be dismissed by school boards on the grounds of their marriage, and she had thought about it carefully. She had also thought about the fact that Daniel had not yet proposed, and that she was a woman who did not intend to allow worry about a hypothetical problem to interfere with an actual joy. He proposed in April. He did it at the fork in the road, which she recognized immediately as the place they had kept arriving at together, the place where their paths technically diverged, and from which they had always chosen to continue together a little further anyway. He had not made a great production of it, because he was not a man for great productions. He had simply stopped at the fork and turned to her, and said that he had been thinking about this very carefully, and that he wanted her to be his wife, and that he understood it was a large thing to ask, and he wanted her to know that his asking had nothing to do with obligation, and everything to do with the fact that she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in his life, and the thought of her leaving or going anywhere that was not also where he was had become genuinely intolerable to him. She had listened to this speech with the full attention she gave to everything he said, and when he was done she had said, "Yes, Daniel, obviously yes." He had a ring. She had not expected a ring. It was a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone set in it, and he told her he had made the setting himself, and the stone he had bought from a Comanche trader who had come through in March. She looked at it on her hand in the April light, and felt the particular completeness of something that has arrived at exactly the right moment. They were married in June, in the church where they had attended the harvest supper the previous autumn, by the minister who had watched their courtship with pastoral approval. Mrs. Hennessy provided enough food for the reception to feed the entire town, which she essentially did, and Dr. Graves acted as the best man in the absence of anyone from Daniel's family, and did it with the good grace of a man who is genuinely pleased to be asked. Eudora wore a dress that was not gray wool and was not blue wool, but was white cotton that she had made herself with assistance from Mrs. Hennessy, and she carried wildflowers from the prairie that the children had brought her that morning in a touching display of collective generosity. Daniel, standing at the altar watching her come down the aisle, had the expression she loved most on his face, the one that was entirely open, the one that had no management in it, just the plain truth of what he felt written across him like a letter he had stopped trying to hide. They said their vows with the quiet certainty of people who have already lived much of what they are promising. After the ceremony, standing outside the church in the June sunlight, Eudora leaned against his arm and looked out at the main street of Caldwell, the place where she had arrived 14 months ago with a carpet bag and a direction, and a name she was about to learn to say out loud. And she thought about the particular strangeness and rightness of how things happen, how a road leads somewhere you could not have anticipated, how a name said carefully in a dusty street turns out to be the beginning of your whole life. Daniel put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm and said, "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking about the first day I arrived here," she said. "And about you dropping your horseshoe." He was quiet for a moment. "I never told you about that." "You dropped it when I spoke," she said. "I watched you. You didn't know I saw." He looked at her with that near smile. "I thought I had been careful." "You were not," she said happily. He turned toward her and said her name, Eudora, with the warmth and ease of someone speaking in their native language, the language they were born to, which was not entirely a new language anymore but was still, in his voice, something that tasted like discovery, because he had learned it late and therefore knew its value precisely. They set up a household in a house on the eastern edge of Caldwell that had been built by a family who had intended to stay and had not, a solidly built house with a parlor and a kitchen, and 2 rooms upstairs, and a porch that faced east into the morning sun. Daniel expanded his forge operation and took on an apprentice, a serious 15-year-old named Marcus who had strong arms and the useful quality of careful listening. Eudora continued to teach school through the autumn term, and then through the spring term, the school board having been persuaded, with some firmness, that the quality of their schoolteacher was more important than the conventional attitudes about married women's employment. She came home to him every afternoon, and he was either at the forge or on the porch with a cup of coffee, and whichever it was she went to him, and he looked up at her with that expression, the one that was still not entirely accustomed to its own good fortune. They argued sometimes, because 2 people with strong minds and strong opinions will argue, and because the particular difficulties of building a shared life out of 2 previously separate lives include the friction of different habits and different assumptions. She thought he was too silent when something bothered him. He thought she was too quick to move forward before she had fully rested on a thing. Both of these things were true, and they said so and worked toward the middle, as people who respect each other do. He told her more about Sarah over time, not all at once but in the way that grief is sometimes best addressed, in pieces, on quiet evenings, on the particular night in October when he brought out a small photograph that he had kept in a chest and showed it to her. The woman in the photograph was young and dark-haired and had a serious expression, and Eudora looked at her with the respectfulness owed to someone who had come before and who was still, in some sense, present. "She would have liked you," Daniel said. "I hope so," Eudora said. "She liked people who spoke plainly and meant what they said," he said. That was a relatively short list. He looked at the photograph. "I have been thinking that I do not need to stop carrying her to be fully present with you, that I was wrong about that it was not a choice between the two." "You were not wrong," Eudora said. "You were protecting yourself in the only way you knew, and you were ready to change it when the time came. That is what matters." He put the photograph away carefully and turned back to her with the look of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for a long time and found that his hands are free. The following spring, Eudora told him one morning at breakfast that she thought they were going to have a child. He looked at her across the breakfast table with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, a flash of pure joy, and then the shadow of fear, the old fear, the one with Sarah's name on it, crossing his face, and then, as she watched, being met and held by something newer and stronger. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Dr. Graves says everything is proceeding exactly as it should. You have already spoken to Graves," he said, with a hint of something that was not quite offense. "I wanted to be certain before I told you," she said. "I did not want to say it unless it was sure." He came around the table and took both her hands in his, which were warm and calloused and entirely steady, and he looked at her with the open expression that was his face's truth. "We will be careful," he said. "Graves is here. You are strong. We will be careful." "We will," she agreed. He pressed her hands once, and then kissed her forehead with a tenderness that had nothing practiced in it. Just a man who has been given something he once thought he had permanently forfeited, and is grateful with every part of himself. In January of 1884, their son was born, a healthy and loud-voiced boy who announced his arrival to the whole of Cedar Street at 2 in the morning, in a manner that suggested he would not be a quiet person. Dr. Graves presided over the birth with the capable calm of a man who has done this many times, and Daniel was present throughout, holding Eudora's hand with the focused steadiness of a person who has decided that nothing will make him look away. When the child was placed in his arms, Daniel stood very still for a long moment. His face was doing something that Eudora, watching from the pillow, thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, the experience of joy arriving in a person who had not expected it to come again. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He looked at her. "I thought James," he said, "for your father." She had told him about her father, the schoolteacher from Virginia who had come west and died of cholera when she was 16. She felt the warmth of that settle over her completely. "James," she said. "That is exactly right. James William Bancroft," Daniel said. "If you agree to the William." She reached up and put her hand against his face. "I agree to the William," she said. James William Bancroft grew up to be a person of strong opinions and considerable energy, who climbed things he was not supposed to climb and asked questions at volume, and was, by general consensus, both enormously trying and completely impossible not to love. He inherited his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity in proportions that were sometimes simultaneously present and sometimes took turns, and he had, from the beginning, the particular quality of a person who will not be deterred from the things he has decided to do. Caldwell continued to grow and change around them. The cattle drives began to shift away as the railroads pushed further south and west, and the nature of the town began to change, becoming more settled, more agricultural, more permanent. Daniel's forge stayed busy because a settled agricultural community needs constant blacksmith work, different work than the trail season had required, but steady and satisfying. The school grew. Eudora taught for 4 more years after James was born, negotiating with successive school board configurations for the right to continue. And in the years when the negotiation did not go her way, she organized evening literacy classes for adults in her parlor and considered it an adequate substitute. She was not a woman who stopped doing useful things because someone told her she should. When James was 3, his sister Alina arrived, and after Eleanor came a second gap of 4 years before their youngest son, Robert, completed the family in 1890. The house on the eastern edge of Caldwell was expanded to accommodate them, Daniel adding 2 rooms with his own hands and the assistance of Marcus, who had grown from an apprentice into a fully capable blacksmith, and who had, in the way of good apprentices, been given full partnership in the forge as soon as he was ready for it. The reading gathering on Friday evenings continued for years. It grew and changed, and had many different participants over time, but it was always the thing that Eudora had started in the schoolroom in the autumn of 1882, the thing that had brought Daniel into a social space for the first time in 6 years, and both of them kept it as a kind of artifact of who they had been to each other at the beginning. There were hard years in the run of it. 1887 was a drought year, and the farming families around Caldwell struggled, and the Bancrofts were not immune to the economic difficulty of a community that is not doing well. They were careful and they managed, and Eudora's school salary in the years she was teaching had given them reserves that got them through. Daniel did not say much about the difficulty, but he worked more hours and slept fewer, and she understood this, and gave him the space he needed and brought him coffee at the forge at intervals, and did not press him with conversation he did not have room for. He came to her one evening after a particularly long day and said, "I have been thinking about what I would have done in these past years without you." She looked up from the book she was reading. "You would have managed," she said. "No," he said with a quiet certainty. "I would not have. I would have kept on in the way I was going, smaller and more silent every year." He sat down next to her on the settee and looked at her with the steadiness of a man who knows his own history. "You came down a street in Caldwell and said your name, and the sound of it broke something open in me that I thought was sealed." He paused. "I have never told you that in those exact words." "You told me in other ways," she said. "I wanted to say it directly," he said. "I have been practicing being direct with you." 8 years of practice," she said, smiling. "Something like that," he said. She set the book on the side table and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her with the ease of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by the goodness of what he has, who has moved through surprise into the quieter and deeper thing that comes after, which is gratitude that does not require constant expression, because it is simply the atmosphere of the place. "Eudora," he said, her name warm and particular and entirely natural in his mouth now, the language learned, the words that had once required such care now simply the language he spoke. She said. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said, and pressed herself more comfortably against his side. And outside the window the Kansas stars were making their particular display over the plains that had taken her in and given her everything she had not known she was looking for. James, at 6 years old, had gotten into the habit of coming downstairs after bedtime on the pretext of needing water, which both his parents knew was a pretext, and chose not to contest because the look on his face when he found them sitting together was a small regular addition to the happiness of the household. He came down now with his bare feet and his serious expression, and climbed onto the settee on the other side of his father and was absorbed into the warmth of the two of them without ceremony. "You should be asleep," Eudora said. "I know," James said, with the honest admission of a child who has already conceded this point internally. "5 minutes," Daniel said. James settled in and looked up at his father with the particular trust of a child who has been given every reason for it, and Daniel looked down at him, and then at Eudora across the small figure between them, and for a moment the lamp and the stars and the sound of the plains in the night were exactly right, the three of them in the circle of the light they had made together. James was asleep in 4 minutes, leaning against his father with the complete surrender of a child who has no doubt of his safety, and Daniel lifted him carefully and carried him back up the stairs, and Eudora listened to the sounds of the house doing what it did, the creak of the stairs, the quiet settling of the boards, the nighttime sounds of a home. He came back down and took his place beside her again, and she handed him his coffee, and he drank it, and they sat in the comfortable quiet that is one of the particular gifts of a long and honest love, the silence that is not absence but fullness, the language beyond language that is learned only over years of choosing each other. She thought about the woman she had been arriving in Caldwell, a practical and somewhat lonesome woman with her carpet bag and her determination, who had asked a question in the middle of a dusty street and received an answer from a man who had not spoken a woman's name in 8 years and had said hers like it was the beginning of something. She thought about how it was, in fact, the beginning of everything. Dr. Graves had become a fixed feature of Caldwell's life and had become, over the years, something that both of them valued privately and separately, a steady presence in the town that they had both, in different ways, contributed to. He delivered Eleanor and Robert and treated the family through the ordinary and extraordinary illnesses of a decade, and he came to Friday evenings and argued about books with the same cheerful combativeness he brought to most things. In 1891, Henry Graves met and married a widow named Charlotte Healy, who had come to Caldwell from Ohio with 2 grown daughters and had taken over the millinery shop from its previous owner. And the Bancrofts were at the wedding, and Eudora danced with Daniel in the open air of the church square under a sky full of late summer stars. And she thought about the first time they had danced, at the harvest supper in 1882, and the care with which he had held her. He held her now without care, which was not the same as holding her carelessly, but was the holding of a man who has moved past the stage of being afraid to hold something because he might lose it, into the stage of holding it with the confidence of someone who has learned to trust what is his. She pressed her face against his shoulder while they danced and thought, "This is the whole of it. This is what I came to Caldwell for. This is the thing that has happened and goes on happening." The years settled into themselves with the unhurried progression of good years, which are not without difficulty or sorrow, but which have a quality of rightness that holds even through the hard moments. James grew into a boy who was going to be tall and who had already demonstrated at 9 that he had his father's gift for working with metal and his mother's gift for reading anything he could get his hands on, and who wanted to know everything about everything with an energy that was exhausting and magnificent. Eleanor at 5 was a fierce and decisive person who had opinions about her own clothing and her own affairs that she expressed without apology, and Robert at 2 was still primarily concerned with the immediate universe of the kitchen floor and was expanding his empirical knowledge of it daily. Eudora had gone back to teaching in 1890 when the school board, under new management, had asked her to return as the head teacher, and she had accepted with the matter-of-fact pleasure of someone resuming something that was rightfully theirs. She organized the school with the experience of someone who knew what worked and the intelligence of someone who kept updating that knowledge. And the school was, by 1892, one of the things that people came to Caldwell for rather than despite. Daniel had expanded the forge into a proper ironworks, with Marcus as his partner and 2 additional workers, making everything from horseshoes to structural ironwork for the new buildings going up as Caldwell continued to grow toward something more permanent than a trail town. He had the reputation of a man whose work could be trusted completely, which was the reputation he had wanted and had worked every day for a decade to earn. He was not a man who talked much about what he was proud of. But sometimes in the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, he would sit on the porch and look at the prairie and the stars with an expression that she had learned to read as contentment, the particular contentment of a man who has found his way back from a very long way away and who knows it. She brought him coffee and sat beside him, and he said her name sometimes, just her name, just that, and it still had a quality in it of the word being savored, of someone who learned a language under difficult circumstances and has never stopped being aware of the privilege of speaking it. In the spring of 1893, they planted a kitchen garden together on the east side of the house, just the 2 of them on a Saturday morning, while Mrs. Hennessy watched the children, working in the dark Kansas soil with the particular companionship of two people, doing something simple together with their hands. She told him she wanted to grow lavender as well as the practical vegetables, because she had always loved the smell of it and had not had a garden before. And he made no objection to anything she wanted and built a small frame for climbing plants along the south-facing wall without being asked. "You did not have to do the frame," she said, finding it there when she came out the following morning. "You mentioned climbing plants," he said from the porch over his coffee. "I mentioned lavender," she said. "Lavender climbs if you give it something to climb," he said, and she looked at him with the particular warmth she felt when he did things like this, the small precise acts of attention that said, more clearly than any declaration, that he had been listening to everything and remembering it, and acting on it in the patient way of a man who has learned that love is not a thing you declare once but a thing you do every day. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her across the yard in the morning light with the full expression, the open one, the one that had no management in it. "I am very glad I came to Caldwell," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She went and sat on the porch beside him, and he handed her his coffee without comment, because she always wanted coffee in the morning and usually forgot to make her own. And they sat in the early spring light with the garden in front of them and the sound of the children waking upstairs and the plains stretching out under the enormous Kansas sky. And it was everything, the whole of it, exactly what it was. That was the story of Daniel Bancroft and Eudora Mercer, who had arrived in a dusty street in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1882, and had asked a question, and received an answer from a man who had not said a woman's name out loud in 8 years, and who had said hers back to her like he was learning a new language, which was the language of allowing yourself to be known by someone, of trusting the risk of love after a long exile from it. He had said her name like it was something rare and newly discovered, because for him it was, because for 8 years silence had been his protection, and she had broken through it not by trying to but by simply being herself, by standing in the middle of a street with a carpet bag and a question, and a name that turned out to be, in his mouth, the sound of a door opening back into the world. He kept saying her name for the rest of his life. He said it every day. He said it in the morning over coffee and in the evening on the porch, and sometimes in the middle of a sentence, just because she was there, and the saying of her name was the truest short statement he knew of how to be exactly where he was. "Eudora," he would say. And she would look up from whatever she was doing and say yes, and it would be enough, more than enough. The whole improbable and necessary and exactly right life of them, built from a horseshoe dropped in surprise, and a name said carefully by a man who had not known, until the moment he said it, that he was ready to come back.